Hello, my gentle and modern apes. Today, on a very delayed episode of Science in Motion, we're discussing one of my favorite of the early hominins, Sahelanthropus tchadensis. Some recent work has come out about this particular ancestor of ours, and these works have anthropologists arguing. New post-cranial material, specifically a piece of a femur, has been assessed by two separate research groups, and these groups have come to very different conclusions on the nature of Sahelanthropus tchadensis. One suggests we boot the budding hominin from the family tree, and the other proposes its position as the root of our lineage is stronger than ever. But who's right, and whose work is monkey business? Let's dig in.
See how the surf hit the ground, and they give it all they've got, and they give it all they've got, and you give it all you've got, till you're down. See how the brain plays around, and you fall inside a hole you couldn't see. You fall inside a hole inside of someone. Help me understand what's going on inside my mind. Doctor, I can't tell if I'm not
Sahelanthropus tchadensis is perhaps best known from the superbly preserved cranium found in 2002, nicknamed Tomai. This skull was important because, while it was certainly a Miocene ape, it had a few features that made it a bit more human-like. The first was a more ventral and anterior foramen magnum, or the hole at the base of the skull. This is important because the human foramen magnum, as well as those of more derived hominins, is seated in this fashion to accommodate our upright walking, unlike that seen in the quadrupedal chimpanzee. Sahelanthropus tchadensis also had smaller canines and has been proposed to lack canine tooth sexual dimorphism. But Sahelanthropus tchadensis is not without controversy, and said controversy has only grown with time. Tomai was discovered by Michael Burnett, and Burnett and his team were also the very first to confidently propose that Sahelanthropus tchadensis may have been bipedal. This was rooted in the nature of that foramen magnum position and angle, which is known to be a pretty good means by which to determine locomotion when used in tandem. Enter Roberto Machiarelli. Another anthropologist, Macchiarelli published in 2018 that he was indeed a bit suspicious of the nature of Tomai being bipedal. This was rooted in what he perceived to be the reluctance of Burnett and company in assigning a partial femur found at the same site to Tomai on the grounds that it would derail the bipedal interpretation and thus remove the specimen from our family tree. That partial femur, TM266, happens to be the subject of this video, and the first paper's author is none other than Macchiarelli himself. Macchiarelli et al. Published officially this month in the Journal of Human Evolution. And his paper was titled Nature and the Relationships of Sahelanthropus tchadensis. Essentially what the paper did was that it determined that this partial femur that was indeed assigned to Sahelanthropus tchadensis and confirmed by this paper to belong to Sahelanthropus tchadensis belonged to a hominid that wasn't actually habitually bipedal. Basically, Macchiarelli was ousting Sahelanthropus tchadensis from the family tree, as emerging bipedality is considered a calling card of early hominins. He instead gave that role to Auroran tchadensis, another early hominin who was almost certainly bipedal, but lived after Sahelanthropus tchadensis by about 1 million years. So what did he do? How did he and his team arrive at this conclusion? And most importantly, are they right? Let's dig our teeth into the paper itself. So I'm actually mini mode on the other side of the screen today so that we can block out the Sci-Hub girl. Even though I love seeing the Sci-Hub girl, she's just not relevant. I don't want to cover up the actual, I guess it's in this direction normally. I don't want to cover up the text. So let's look at Macchiarelli's paper, Nature and Relationships of Sahelanthropus tchadensis. So here they discuss the partial left femur here, talking about when it was discovered and where it was discovered, which is in Chad. Now, Chad isn't typically considered East Africa, which is where we tend to find most of our hominin fossils, as well as South Africa. But early hominins tend to be around East Africa. So they're letting us know where we found it, and talking about the differences between TM266 and the other late Miocene ape that is typically considered to be bipedal, or tchadensis, which we also have a partial femur of. Essentially what the paper concludes in the abstract is right here. The results of our preliminary functional analysis suggest that TM266 femoral shaft belongs to an individual that was not habitually bipedal, something that should be taken into account when considering the relationship of Sahelanthropus tchadensis. The circumstances of its discovery should encourage researchers to check and see whether there is more post-cranial evidence of Sahelanthropus tchadensis among the fossils recovered from Tauros manala. So great. That's the conclusion that they reached. How did they reach it? Because that really is part of the important stuff here. Notice too, Bernard Wood is on this paper. Bernard Wood's great. He's got a lot of really good work. So we're going to kind of skip the introduction, just because the introduction I kind of gave to you already, and is while it is important, it's not necessarily important for what we're discussing, what we want to see. So here's the partial femur. What you'll notice about this femur is it's the shaft mostly. But that is to say, it is the diaphysis, the long bone of the femur, rather than the two epiphyses, which are the distal and proximal ends of the femur that contain like the femoral head and the knee, basically. So here's a picture of it from several different angles, as well as kind of calling it a figure. Here's the cross-section, which is going to be important, because what you're going to see is the cross-section is primarily what Macchiarelli is looking at. His analysis concerns the cross-section and is essentially, well, comparative materials, it's right here. He's essentially taking the cross-section of the femur and comparing it to other apes, other hominoids. Here's B and C that also show some more of the femur, the details of TM266. So let's see how they did this. The comparative data used in the analysis, include measurements taken from the partial femora, BAR, and BAR, basically the Aurora and tchadensis specimens, and from samples representing the Australopiths, both the gracile and the more robust, that is to say, Australopithecus and Paranthropus, modern humans, and extant great apes. Two late Miocene great apes, including Rudopithecus and Hispanopithecus, were also included in the comparative analysis of the cross-sectional shape of the distal femoral shaft. That's a great sample size. The reason this is so good is because you're including humans, which are obviously bipedal animals, we walk on 2 feet, as well as Australopithecus and Paranthropus, two other definitively bipedal hominins. These guys definitely walked on 2 feet. And then they're also including the extant great apes, which is to say the chimps and bonobos, members of genus Pan, gorilla, and pongo. So that's already a great sample size, but they also include other Miocene apes, including Rudopithecus and Hispanopithecus, just to round everything off and consider TM266, the Sahelanthropus tchadensis femur, in the context of other living Miocene apes, other animals living at the same time. So essentially they take cross-sections of all of them, list the ones that they're using here, which is just it's just a great sample size. There are a lot of individual specimens that are being used here. Modern humans talks about where we're getting the chimps from. 42 adult individuals. We're using a whole lot, 96 adult individuals of both sexes from humans. Talking about where we're getting the gorilla from as well. 47 adult gorillas. Orangutans, we're getting several as well. 5 adult females and 3 males, as well as some juveniles. And we're looking at, obviously you have less material to look at from Rudopithecus and from Hispanopithecus, but we are looking at them. It's a really good analysis. It's really comprehensive with regard to the sample size of species that are involved. And it's essentially telling us what cross-section we're looking at, taking it from the same place in all of these femurs in order to make sure that our analysis is sufficient and consistent. And here are the results of the comparative analysis. The size and morphology of the TM266 femoral shaft are much more consistent with it belonging to a fossil hominid rather than to a fossil monkey, obviously. This is going to be, hominids are basically going to include ourselves, the great apes, the extinct great apes, and all of the hominins that are along our lineage and along their lineages. The external morphology of the shaft is closer to that of common chimpanzees than to modern humans, gorillas, or orangutans. So that's interesting too. So the shaft is actually most similar to modern members of genus Pan, to the exclusion of not just humans, but also gorilla and orangutan. This is important because gorillas, humans, orangutans, and chimps, as well as bonobos, all locomote kind of uniquely from one another. So here's our analysis kind of to the side. They're talking about the functional assessment, talking about how erect posture and bipedal locomotion have traditionally been the classic calling cards of what is a hominin. That in addition to the dentition, so reducing canines, is kind of how we tell whether these early hominins of the late Miocene are in our lineage or in a lineage such as like that of the Pannins or the gorillans. So here's our analysis over here to the right. We can go through it, but it's really not. I was summarizing it is going to give the same effect, all things considered. Here's where TM266 lands. Interestingly enough, Homo and Pongo are kind of mapping across the same x-axis, but then Homo's mapping along the y with gorilla and Pan. So that's really interesting. TM is not by any means like super distant from Homo, but it is certainly mapping with Pan more than it is with any of the others. Here's a nice look at the cross sections. So what we can see here is the cross section in overall size and shape does seem to be most similar to Pan. Now, just eyeballing it, which is of course not good science, but that's kind of what we got here with this cross-sectional look. It seems to also map close-ish with human females, along with this kind of rounder shape that's, a bit circular rather than this kind of angle that we see in the males. It's certainly very unique from gorilla and from Pongo. So while I can absolutely agree that Pan is what it's mapping most closely with, humans aren't that far off. So continue moving down. Here's another look at the mapping. Here's TM266. And as we just said, Homo along with Pan, it's definitely more on the Homo Pan side than it is on the Gorilla Pongo side, and more similar to Pan than it is to humans. But we're second, so that's kind of interesting. So essentially the paper continues to talk about the technical aspects of what they've done and why their analysis is rigorous, and it is indeed with regard to this cross-section. Here it shows kind of the projected femoral head and what that might look like. Projections aren't always accurate, but they do pretty dang well. So, you can't help but think, okay, well, this has been pretty rigorous. I don't really see any problems outright with what they're doing. I mean, the work seems great. Now, in the discussion immediately, we start kind of roasting Guy. Guy et al. In 2005 suggests that further research is needed to determine the evolutionary relationships between Sahelanthropus and known Miocene and Pliocene hominids. And in the final section of their article, they make a plea for more information. Which is true. We didn't really have all that much post-crania, none that had been examined. Although this TM266 was found in that same fossil bed as Tomai, our classic crania. And basically the conclusion that they come to is found here at the bottom and kind of mimics what we saw in the abstract. The lack of clear evidence that TM266 femur is from a hominid that was habitually bipedal further weakens the already weak case for Sahelanthropus tchadensis being a stem hominin. However, this in no way diminishes the significance of Sahelanthropus tchadensis. There's compelling evidence that for at least the last 4 million years, the hominid clade shows evidence of taxonomic and thus lineage diversity. If this is the case, the minority of extinct hominin taxa that have been recognized are likely to be ancestors of modern humans. If this is the case, the minority of extinct hominin taxa that have been recognized are likely to be the ancestors of modern humans. Essentially what they're saying is, we're probably looking at, of all of the hominids that we actually have, very few of them are probably in our direct line. This isn't anything new. This is something anthropologists have been saying for quite some time. This is why when we say transitional species, what we're actually meaning isn't that this animal is literally in the direct lineage of species A to species B, but rather it occupies a position along the gradient of change that we expect to see from the traits of species A and the traits of species B. That's what a transitional species is. Most will turn out to be non-ancestral close relatives, but presently it is difficult to sort the ancestors from non-ancestral close relatives. There is no logical reason to think that the same problems and limitations do not also apply to the Miocene hominids, the late Miocene hominids. It will not be easy, especially if the fossil evidence is relatively meager, to work out which late Miocene taxa are hominins, which are panins, and which are neither. Notice that they don't include the gorillas in that. That's because humans and chimps, that is to say the genus Hominin, the genus Pan, are much more similar, morphologically speaking, than either is to gorilla. As one of us has suggested, exactly where in Africa and under what circumstances the ape-human demarcation began, and when, how, and why the ape-human boundary became irrevocably established are important research challenges that are still unresolved. But if we treat the hominin status of Sahelanthropus tchadensis or any other enigmatic taxon as the given and not as a hypothesis, we run the risk of adding further confusion to a picture that is already complicated and less easy to resolve. Guy et al., 2005. So, I agree with that, actually. I think it's very silly that we're so quick to say, this is the latest human relative. We don't know for sure which are for sure human relatives and which aren't. But they're still transitional species, and they're still members of our family tree. We just don't know what that direct line looks like. And to say that we do is to kind of sensationalize and set ourselves up for failure when we inevitably find that some members aren't in that direct line, and some members that we thought weren't are. So that pretty much sums up the Macchiarelli paper. Macchiarelli's analysis is excellent. It covers an enormous sample size of species ranging from extant to extinct and specimens of all kinds. But his analysis is not the only one that covers TM266. In fact, just a few months earlier, there was a very different analysis that emerged in a pre-screen for Nature, another very good journal. And this paper's conclusions were essentially the polar opposite of Macchiarelli's, using a wholly unique analysis. Enter Frank Guy. Guy was an author on the original paper concerning Tomai, along with Burnett back in 2002, and since then he has been a Sahelanthropus tchadensis maniac. He's been an author on the great majority of all the work that's come out on this hominin, from geology and paleontology of the fossil site, to the cranium reconstruction, to the emergent material. That is to say, Frank Guy knows this hominin very, very well, perhaps better than anyone. This is a double-edged sword, though, as undoubtedly he falls victim to considering the conventional assessment that Sahelanthropus is this definitively bipedal animal. Fortunately, we can assess his work in a vacuum. So, what kind of work did Guy et al. Do? So here we are at the in review for Nature Research. It says at the beginning in a large disclaimer, this preprint is under consideration at the Nature Research journals. So it's saying preprints are preliminary reports, haven't undergone peer review. That should all be kept in mind as we look at this paper. Peer review timeline, current status, under review. So now you might be wondering, okay, why is this out there if it hasn't been peer reviewed? Well, that's to make sure that the public is kind of aware of the various works that are going on when something novel kind of happens. It's so you can keep your work from being poached by others, perhaps even the peer reviewers themselves. It's a fail-safe. It's a way to essentially say, if you're Guy et al., here's the work that we've done, no one steal our idea, they're already reviewing it. So the public can help hold everyone accountable. So this research article that may appear in Nature is titled Post-Cranial Evidence of Late Miocene Hominin Bipedalism in Chad. It's about Sahelanthropus tchadensis. Tchadensis literally means from Chad. So, here's the abstract first. Terrestrial bipedal locomotion is one of the key adaptations defining the hominin clade. So this is something that Macchiarelli also made very clear. Evidences of undisputed bipedalism are known from post-cranial remains of late Miocene hominids as soon as 6 million years old in eastern Africa. That would be Aurora tchadensis. Bipedality of Sahelanthropus tchadensis was hitherto documented at 7 million years ago in Central Africa, Chad, by cranial evidence. That would be that foramen magnum that's position and angle was informing the bipedal interpretation. Here we present the first post-cranial evidence of the locomotor behavior of the Tchadian hominin with new insights on bipedalism at the early stage of our evolutionary history. The original material was discovered at locality TM266, the Toro-Manala fossiliferous area, and consists of 1 left femur and 2 antemeric ulnae. These new findings confirm that hominins were already terrestrial bipeds relatively soon after the chimp-human divergence, but also suggest that careful climbing arboreal behaviors were still a significant part of their locomotor repertoire. Very much the opposite of what Macchiarelli et al. Found to be the case. So, why is this their conclusion? Let's dig into that a little bit. So the main text goes over basically the nature of what TM266 is. It discusses, the dimensions, how it's curved, how long it is, and what other potential archaic fossil apes it's similar to, like Nocholopithecus and Akimbo. And it goes forward talking about, basically the minutiae that you would only be interested in if you were like really, really into this stuff. Talking about, like the the thick cortical bone in the cross section, sharp small reliefs indicative of the third trochanter, continuing to a rugose surface that distally blends with the lateral component of the broad protolinear aspera. Protolinear aspera. So, nerd stuff, basically. But that's not really what we care about. What we really want to see is how they came to the conclusion that this animal was bipedal. So, cortical area of the second moment area are biomechanical parameters frequently used to infer habitual locomotor functions in primates. So basically saying cortical area and second moment of area. This is like a means by which to determine locomotion in primates. It's a calling card. They reflect loads undergone by long bones during growth. So they reflect how big a bone's going to grow in length and in width. The second moment of area measures the resistance to bending loads. Bending loads are going to be important as they can kind of help you tell where the weight is being held. They basically talk about a bunch of different really interesting equations that they use, but that are a little bit over my head even. Talking about stature, body mass, forelimb bones potentially attributed to Sahelanthropus tchadensis. Those would be those ulnae that we talked about. Interestingly enough, this paper recognizes Australopithecus prometheus, which is not typically an Australopithecine that I see kind of purported to be legitimate all the time. But it's interesting. So let's see what their actual methodology is. The Taurus-Manala femur exhibits several hallmarks of habitual terrestrial bipedalism. Among them, a well-defined broad protolinea aspera, the presence of a lateral third trochanter and associated subtrochanteric platymeria without hypotrochantic and inferior lateral fossae, is classically associated with enhanced hip flexion extension. So basically they're saying the traits of this bone lend themselves to sticking your leg out in a flexed motion. While a particularly developed calcer femorale facilitates compressive loads dispelling in terrestrial bipedalism. So basically other aspects of the bone help with compression load bearing. So stepping downward or perhaps stomping downward in the case of running. This is why humans get shin splints, by the way. Despite some of the above-mentioned traits, these features go with an overall cortical bone distribution pattern and cross-section geometries of the femoral shaft that suggest muscular recruitments and bone loads compatible with habitual bipedalism. So this is interesting here, because what they're basically saying is they're mentioning cortical bone distribution, which is something that Macchiarelli et al. Didn't really touch on, but they also do talk about the cross-section geometries, and they're basically saying here cross-section geometries are compatible with habitual bipedalism. So their take is, maybe it's not a perfect match for habitual bipedalism like some of these other well-defined broad traits that tend to define a biped, but they're still compatible with them. Despite some of the above-mentioned traits are suggested to be the primitive condition in hominins. They are part of the functional complex co-opted for bipedalism. They are routinely considered as such to infer potential bipedal terrestrial locomotion in early Eastern African hominins. And then they give a boatload of traits. So this is really interesting because what Guy et al. Has done here is he said, whether he knows what Macchiarelli was doing or not, he's basically saying there's a whole suite of easily sourceable traits that we know define bipedalism in hominins. And the TM266 femur does possess a great many of these traits, and then he sources them. The Tchadian hind limb bone conforms to the overall morphological pattern of Miocene hominin terrestrial bipeds. Conforms to the overall pattern. So this is essentially allowing for the things like the cross-section being more in line with the pannons, which is interesting because Macchiarelli didn't touch on any of these things. Macchiarelli didn't really discuss these calling cards that the femur does possess that do conform with bipedalism. He focused very much in on that cross-section, that is to say the aspect that wasn't perfectly in line. The forelimbs morphology rules out the arboreal specialization for the Tchadian material, as in Ardipithecus ramidus and presumably Aurora and tchadensis. This is interesting too because this paper analyzes not just the femur, but like the ulnae, which is also post-cranial material from the Miocene Chad hominin. So basically they looked at Sahelanthropus tchadensis arm bones and were like, okay, well, it's not swinging around in the trees, it's not suspending itself. That leaves knuckle walking and bipedalism, and it looks like most of the traits we see in the hind limbs conform to that of a biped. Yet the Tchadian post-cranial material displays a suite of morphological features that are consistent with substantial stereotypical arboreal behaviors, as suggested by the ulnar shaft curvature and cross-sectional geometric patterns, whereas the elbow morphology is potentially indicative of careful climbing and does not display any evidence of knuckle walking. So this is really interesting too, because they're like, some of the post-crania, including that in the hind limb, looks like it may be adapted for clambering around in the trees. Not suspending, mind you, not swinging, but clambering, careful climbing. And most importantly, there is no evidence of knuckle walking. So if there is any terrestrial support, it would have had to be on two legs, according to this paper. Recently it was suggested that the putative stem hominid, blah, 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 talking about obligate bipedalism, obligate arboreal bipedalism, which is a weird concept, walking around in the trees on 2 feet. And continuing onward, discussing the nature of Ardipithecus cadaba and ramidus. Instead, the Tchadian remains described herein reassert African roots. They are the first direct evidence of an obligate terrestrial biped, indistinguishable from that inferred for Aurora tchadensis and Ardipithecus cadaba/ramidus. This is interesting too because we know that there are distinguishable aspects, at least in the cross-section, but what Guy has done is taken a great many traits and assessed them all in tandem with one another. The Tchadian remains suggest a conservative evolution of climbing capacities, interpreted as cautious climbing, as in some stem apes. So other stem apes were cautious climbers, like it earlier mentioned akimbo. Hence, cautious climbing modality weakens a potential role of suspension in the emergence of the hominin clade. They basically assert this with the presence of the paleo environment being this open woodland area with significant cover, but nothing like a tropical jungle. Taken as a whole, Eastern African early hominins share an arboreal component in their habitat. Yes, we do know that. Environmental indicators in the fossiliferous area suggest the heterogeneous landscape. That's that kind of woodland with a grassland in there as well. Based on molecular data, the chimpanzee-human last common ancestor is estimated to have occurred in Africa between 10 and 7 million years ago. Indeed, fossil representatives of the Pannon clade are too scarce and consist of a minimum of 3 Middle Pleistocene teeth, and a chimpanzee-like proximal femur epiphysis from an unknown age in Uganda. However, the last 3 taxa, at least 3 taxa, have been described between 10 and 7 million years ago in African deposits, from Simberupithecus in the Simberu Hills, Nakalopithecus from Nakili, and Chloropithecus from the Middle Awash. These Miocene taxa are parsimoniously assigned to stem hominines, even if Simberupithecus displays a particularly archaic morphology. So we're talking about other Miocene apes and how they fit into the picture. And that's kind of the whole of it. Now this paper did come out before Macchiarelli et al., but it's not been peer reviewed. So when all is said and done, it will have come after. This combination is arguably more similar to the condition observed in the later hominins than in any other African fossil or extant on hominoids. So that's them discussing the derived traits in Sahelanthropus, Auroran, and Ardipithecus, having their lacking the premolar honin complex in the teeth, along with having those reduced canines and lack of canine sexual dimorphism. Basically, he's saying, look at all of the very derived aspects of Sahelanthropus tchadensis not even discussed in the Post-Cranial here in this paper today. It's probably safe to say that this is a stem hominin. And that's kind of the long and short of what Guy et al. Has done. The actual methodology involves a whole lot of measuring different portions of the bone. They also do a cross-sectional analysis, which is, important. They do it, I think, to a bit of a different percentage, and I believe come to the same conclusion that it's most similar to Pan. I don't actually know that they outright say it, but I know their results are very similar. But again, mostly what the basis of this bipedalism in Sahelanthropus tchadensis is coming from the measurements that have been taken of all aspects of the femur, as well as the ulnae, as well as the skull. So that's kind of the summary of what we've got for Guy. So while Macchiarelli's study went above and beyond with regard to this hyper-focused analysis on the cross-section of the femur, Guy opted for an assessment of all of these broad morphological characteristics in almost a vaguer but more comprehensive fashion, if that makes sense. So who's right? Unfortunately, we don't really know yet. Both papers have strengths and weaknesses in their overall cases. Macchiarelli's work is superb in its analysis of the cross-section, making excellent use of other available material in order to compare, contrast, and draw potential relationships. He isn't swayed by the reigning opinion of the foreshore biped, instead opting to compare TM266 in something of a vacuum. But Macchiarelli's laser focus on one single trait, the cross-section, may miss the forest for the trees. Macchiarelli is also already published in a peer-reviewed journal, while Guy is still under review. Guy is impeccably thorough in his overall assessment, using a broader scope that muddles the more clear-cut nature of comparing a single trait. His assessment takes the whole rather than the single minutiae, allowing for a more cohesive look at the hominin that TM266 belonged to. However, Guy is also invested in this species, a relationship that could give him both greater insight and a heavier bias when compared to Macchiarelli. Guy is also still under review for publishing, but if accepted, that journal would be Nature, perhaps the most rigorously peer-reviewed journal out there. In my opinion, we still need a lot more data, but I do tend to side a bit with Guy overall. A cross-section of the femur isn't really enough in my mind to completely preclude bipedalism in the hominin that TM266 belongs to, especially in the light of all of the other traits that specimen shares with pretty definitive bipeds like Auroran tchadensis and Ardipithecus ramidus. Because you can't really define a hominin's position by just a single trait, at least not definitively. If you were to do that with Ardipithecus ramidus and you were to look at the canine tooth size and say, well, they're smaller than a chimpanzee's, of course, but they're definitely bigger than a human's by a significant amount, so I guess the hominin belongs to the panins, right? It's got these, big honking canine teeth. And that's where it maps when we put it onto a graph, essentially. But that would be really silly because we have all of this other material from Ardipithecus ramidus that tells us that the great majority of its features place it on a derived trend towards anatomically modern humans and not anatomically modern Pan. So I myself am waiting to pass judgment. Perhaps Macchiarelli will be right and Auroran tchadensis really is the first of our line. But to me, Tomai still clings to the family tree, even if it's at the base.